Hey, you guys. Got an interesting thought experiment to suggest to you. So, if you imagine that, in fact, let's just rewind a little bit. A lot of people, we have lots of discussions in the comments about should beginners study opening theory, and in general, my approach is that you can by memorizing some moves, what to do if your opponent does ABC, you can find ways to get a slight advantage over your opponent in many games. But in general, my advice is you are far better off studying and learning and applying opening principles than you are applying opening theory at the beginner and improving level. So what I thought we would do is let's just take this thought experiment that aliens have come and removed, they've eradicated, they've erased anything that you know about chess openings from your brain, right? It's like I was out on the hill and saw a big flash of light, and then when I wake up I was back in my truck and I'd forgotten all my opening theory. Okay, just imagine that, right? Aliens have taken away your opening theory. And so what that forces you to do is be like the goldfish. You have to read the board. And I think that if you do that, instead of thinking, oh, I play the London, I play the King's Indian, I play, whatever it may be, and actually read the board, and this obviously relies on you playing reasonable time controls where you've got time to think and to find the best moves. So what I thought it might be fun to do is that we'll start with the white pieces and we'll look at all of the possible first moves for white, and let's evaluate how good they are, right? Or why you would play them, why you wouldn't play them. Okay, so first of all, let's just revise our opening principles. So what do you want to do in the opening? So classically, people say you want to control the center. What is the center? It's these four squares, right? If you imagine that those four squares are like the high ground, if you imagine like a fort that's built on a mound, that is the top of the mound. Anyone who tries to attack that is attacking uphill. So if you get your pieces into these squares, then you have the slope advantage in a sense, right? And the reason is because it is kind of downhill from here, in the sense that from the center of the board, your pieces can control more squares, right? And more influential squares. So for example, a knight that's right in the corner, we've said this lots of times, can only reach 2 squares from there, okay? But a knight that's here, right, when it's in this central 4x4, can reach 8 squares. And that's the maximum that a knight can address from any square. So as long as the knight is inside this, it can reach more squares. Okay. Likewise, and also very often that you tend to find traffic around the corners. You'll have pawns in the corner. So, a queen who finds herself there may have very little scope, but a queen who's in the center of the board could reach a lot of different squares, can control a lot of the board from there. Likewise, a pawn that's advanced into the center is only attacking 1 square, right? But a pawn that's on the edge, but a pawn that's here is attacking 2 squares, or any other square other than the two edge squares, right? So it's all about control. It's about controlling the board. It's about exerting more influence over the board than your opponent has got. And why do you want to do that? Because you want to increase the number of options that you have for your moves, and on the flip side, you want to decrease the options that your opponent has for their moves. Okay, so control of the center. Yes, that's one thing we know. Okay, now there are these modern approaches, the hyper-modern approaches where you play, for example, for like bishop fianchetto or even fianchetto both bishops, and don't compete for the center in the opening, but you're going to compete for the center later on in the middle game. I do not recommend that approach for beginners in general. Okay, much better to learn the classical principles and then later on know when to bend or break those rules. Okay, so what else do you want to do in the opening? Well, you want to develop your pieces. Why do you want to develop your pieces? Well, for the same reasons we've just said. When your pieces are on the back rank, their scope is limited, okay? This rook has no squares. The bishops have no squares, okay? The queen and the king have no squares. The only pieces that can move at the start of the game are the knights, okay? They've got 2 possible moves each. That's it, okay? So your pieces at the start of the game are very, very constrained. So what we talk about development, and development means getting those pieces off the back rank, ideally close to the center, right? Where they have the uphill advantage, they have the height advantage, and they can control more of the board. All right. So what do we then have to do in order to get our pieces out? Well, we know that the knights can jump straight out anyway, and they both have a very natural square. Yeah. Sometimes they'll come to e2 or d2, right? Sometimes you might have one knight coming here and one knight coming here, where they're defending each other. That's not uncommon, but in general, the knights know where they're going, and they want to get into this central square. Why do they want to get into the central square? Well, a knight that's in that central square, the central 4x4, not the absolute center, right? A knight that's in this central square can control its maximum range. It has its maximum range. It is not constrained. So your knights will generally very often want to go there. Okay. Now, then comes the issue of your bishops. Now, it's possible for a bishop actually to take part in the game on its first move. So say, for example, your opponent has played h6 at some point to try and remove this square from your knight that might be there, right? Sometimes your bishop can go boom, like the Greek gift, eradicate the pawn, or whatever, open up the game, and that's its first and only move of the game, right? So that's a possibility with bishops. Also, bishops tend to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6, 7 different choices of squares where they can go to. And likewise this guy, 7 different squares where it can go to. And that's very different to the knight. So normally you want to develop your knights first and then decide where you want to put your bishops. Why? Because where your knights are going to go is fairly predictable, right? They don't want to come to these squares, so it's dumb squares. Because from those squares, they've only got 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 options, right? And this guy, 4 options. Not good, right? Much better to be in the center where you've got 8 squares under your influence. And when you control a square, it means that you can put your piece on that protected square and have it defended. It means that your opponent cannot put a valuable piece on that square because it could be captured, right? So it's influence, 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 influence. So let's now look at all of White's possible first moves from the point of view that aliens erased my opening theory. Okay, so how many opening moves are there? Have you ever sat to think how many opening moves there are for White? Okay, well, it's pretty simple to calculate. There are 20 possible starting moves, and they have all been played at the master level. Here I've got the chess.com Explorer open. There are 20 opening moves, and they've all been played. However, the very worst one has only been played 23 times compared to e4 that's been played 1.3 million times at the opening level. Right, so let's go through them in order. Okay. Oh, in fact, so what are the 20 opening moves? Well, they are, each pawn can move either 1 square or 2 squares. Okay, so that is 8 times 2 options equals 16. Right. In addition to that, this knight can go there or there. This knight can go there or there. Okay, that's it. The 20 possible opening moves. Now, some of those are better than others. Some of them are worse. So we're going to go down the list. And we'll look at. One other thing before we start. We've mentioned that the bishops and the queen and the king and the rooks have no mobility at the start of the game, zero. They cannot move at the start of the game. They cannot move on. So in order to get your bishops out into the game, and we talk about this a lot, right? For this guy to enter the board, either the b2 pawn or the d2 pawn must vacate its square. Okay? And exactly the same for this guy, right? The e pawn or the g pawn must move in order for the king's bishop to come out. If these pawns never move in the game, this bishop's never moving in the game. And the same for this, right? So there's some options. Very often you'll find the central pawns moving, okay? And sometimes you'll find the b pawn or the g pawn moving. And the bishop can then go either here, sometimes to the edge of the board, but very often goes to g2 or to b2, and that is called fianchetto. Okay, not fianchetto, fianchetto. The ch in Italian is a k sound, not ch. So it's kind of the opposite to English. So there you go. All right, so let's go through the top 20. Dun, 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 dun. Right, we'll go from the top actually, rather than a countdown from 20. So most popular move, starting move in chess, pawn to e4. Okay, so why is this a good move? Well, let's see what we've considered. Okay, obviously the knights are free to enter the game. Okay, that's the case with most opening moves, not all, right? So the knights are uninterrupted, unimpeded. What's more, this bishop now has all that to go to, right? It's got that many safe squares, right? Can't really go to a6 because it'll get captured, right? Also, the queen has 4 more squares that she can go to, okay? So the knights are free, this bishop is free, this queen is free. In fact, we could probably put them in green, you know. The rooks are still constrained, and this bishop is still constrained, okay? So we've got 4 of our pieces. We'll ignore the king for now, because the king really doesn't want to be, unless you're going to play some crazy ass bomb cloud opening, you're not going to be playing king to e2, okay? Because that's just mental, right? But we've got 4 pieces now that are free to enter the game. So you've created options for yourself. What's more, this pawn on e4 is controlling 1 square in the center here, and it's controlling the f5 square as well. So there you go. And what that means is that this knight can't jump out to here, right? Because if it does, it'll get captured. Another thought is that this knight can't really come to here either, because then you play that. How many times has this been played? Knight to f6, let's have a look. Knight to f6 is like the 8th most popular move. That's Alekhine's defense, okay? And when knight to f6, we know that, because chess.com Opening Explorer will tell you, e5 is the next move. And then the knight has to move again, okay? So that has broken an opening principle. So we've remembered our opening principles. We know these, right? We're working with opening principles. We've forgotten everything we know about theory, right? This is principled play, okay? You don't want to move a piece that you've already moved in the opening a second time until you've got all of your pieces out on the board. That is the ideal. Why is it the ideal? Well, because now that black has spent his second move moving this knight, okay, he hasn't spent his second move moving any of these pawns to help release any of his bishops or his queen, right? All these pieces are still completely trapped in. So the only piece that can come out on black's side now is his other knight, right? Stands to reason. Okay, so what black wants to do here is play some kind of other move, and the 2 most common moves that we see at the master level are pawn to c5, right, and pawn to e5. Now, pawn to e5 is the mirror image of this one, so all the things that we've said about e4 apply to e5 equally. Okay, all good. c5 is slightly different. This is the Sicilian, and it's been played twice as often as e5. So the Sicilian at the very top level is played a lot, And what you notice about this is that it's one of these pawns, right? The C pawn and the F pawn, in general, there's a downside, okay? And the downside is that it's not one of these pawns, okay? So these guys, when you move the C pawn or the F pawn, okay? Apologise for the ducks having commentary in the background. I've got my door open, right? Does nothing to release a bishop, okay? But that's not the idea with the Sicilian, right? The idea with the Sicilian, we don't even know what the Sicilian is, okay? So what is black trying to do here? Black is preventing white from playing his other central pawn straight into the middle. Because if white gets to do that, right, then white is controlling 1, 2, 3, 4 very, very important squares in black's territory, okay? Taking away these squares from black's pieces. Okay, so that's the ideal, but anyway. But we're just looking at move 1 right now. So e4 is move number 1. Reason is, controls squares in the center, releases bishop, releases queen, doesn't impede the knights. Okay, so let's take that back. Let's look at the second most popular move. Pawn to d4, right? Now, this is played, so e4 has been played 1.3 million times, d4 has been played just over 1 million times. Okay, so it's slightly less popular than e4. Why is it slightly less popular? Well, it's slightly different. Okay, now, the knights can come out. Great. The knights have not been impeded. This bishop now has 1, 2, 3, 4 good options. That's not a very good option because it will get grabbed by the pawn. Okay, so the queen's bishop has been released. The queen, you might argue, has also been released, but the queen can only move to these 2 forward squares. Compare that to e4, where the queen has 1, 2, 3, 4 squares. Yeah, 4 fresh new squares for the queen, but with d4, 2 fresh squares. And so, you know, they're not as good. So, but from an opening standpoint, that's fine. And if we get to play e4 as well, then that's great. We're all happy. We're controlling lots of space in the center, and we can go on and have a good game of chess. So that's the idea. So that's move number 2. d4 is good, right? Other moves, knight to f3, the reti opening. Okay, why is this a good idea? Well, it controls 2 squares in the middle. It also newly controls these 2 squares, and it defends this one and this one, right? So that's not a bad move either. So you're controlling 2 of the central squares with that move, whereas with, say, e4, you're controlling 1 central square and f5 as well. Okay, so that's why the reti opening, where you bring your knight out here, is a good idea. You're preventing black from playing pawn to e5. Okay, and e5, is it played? It's been played 13 times, right? And white has won 54% against 31%. So that's not a great opening because you'll just get your pawn taken, okay? In fact, you don't just get your pawn taken. Apparently the grandmasters play e4. Go figure. Okay? Because I guess if you capture, white's just going to kick the knight and then you have to come back and then look. You know, now black can now develop his knight, and look, black actually now has an advantage. Why? Because you've moved your knight. This is your second move, and your third move. All 3 moves, same piece. Okay, so the knight has gone back to okay, and black, although he's lost a pawn, now gets to develop say one of his knights completely for free, or his bishop comes out, or whatever he wants to do. So black actually gets the initiative in that opening. Okay, so that's the reti opening. Okay, you've got a knight in the central 16, all good. You're controlling a couple of squares on the board, right? That's not a bad thing. So that's why it's third most popular move, right? What's the 4th most popular? c4. Okay. And we are just learning, it's telling me this is called the English opening. Well, I didn't know that because I've forgotten all my opening theory because the aliens erased it. Okay, slightly odd, which is why it's not a top 3 move. So with this, we're controlling, yes, 1 central square here, and we're also controlling b5, which isn't maybe the most important square either, right? So we're controlling them. The queen now has 3 squares where she can come out to. Okay, so that's not a bad thing. Again, we're not impeding our knights, right? But we've done nothing to release either of our bishops. So the English opening, well, pawn to c4 is an idea, but you can see why it's less popular than these 2 moves, right? Okay, what about 5? g3. Okay, what's the point of this? Well, the point is, okay, so we're controlling these 2 squares, right? And that's not as good as controlling these squares, because it's not the center, right? This is the center, the blue bit. Okay, now, so what's the point of this? The point is we'll probably fianchetto the bishop, might play the knight to f3, and we're going to castle, and go for this King's Indian setup on the king side. Okay, you might also then be preparing to push f4. So, for example, e5, 4th most popular move from black. You might choose to play f4 now, would you? No, c4 is played most often here. Okay, apparently f4 just isn't played at all. Zero moves. Okay, so that's not even an idea. Well, apparently it's been played 5 times. Okay, but that would be a very unusual way to start. So, point of this is, yeah, you want to fianchetto the bishop, put the bishop on a long diagonal where it's controlling lots and lots of squares, and probably go ahead and bring out the knight. So you can see why it's not as strong as the other ones, because when you do this, you're inviting your opponent to grab the center by moving one of their pawns. Okay, so I put my bishop here, he puts his pawn there. No worries, I'm happy about that. Okay, bishop can't take because queen takes the bishop, and black now has the initiative in the center. Okay, and this has been seen over 1,000 times, this position. Okay, so that is c4. Now that is g3, so we've done the top 5 now. The next most popular, b3. Exactly the same thing on the other side of the board, right? Yes, the knights can still come out. This bishop has 2 extra options. This is known as the Nimzovich-Larsen attack for some reason, but that's in there at number 6, okay? However, you're not controlling any of these squares, which are very, very important squares. You're not looking down at this sensitive square on here. Now, it's worth noting, because we talked about c4, so c4 is the 4th most popular move. We're going to get to f4 now. f4, right? Bird's opening. Less often played, only played about 7,000 times, okay, at the master level. And let's see, so f4, oh, 10,300 times, okay? Bird's opening, it's an odd opening. Now, this to me is clearly has its weaknesses, right? Yes, we are controlling one central square, okay? So we are preventing black from playing e5, okay? Black does not play e5 here very often, and in fact, when it does, it's kind of equal for white and black. So, and you're controlling this square, which is not a major, the knight doesn't want to come there, it's not a massive square. Plus, what you are doing is you're opening up this diagonal towards the king, okay? Now, as I've said lots and lots of times, Grandmaster Ben Feingold, says that the f pawn, F stands for forget about it. You don't want to never play the f pawn, right? Just don't push it. Leave it there. Keep that cover for your king. It's like a shield in front of your king, right? Leave it there, and that's the reason why. Yes, the knights can still come out, but you're doing nothing to release this bishop or this bishop. They're still stuck in. Okay, so that's why it's not so good. Okay, and the next move is knight to c3. Okay, so just the same deal with knight to f3 that we saw earlier. It's controlling 2 central squares, which is a good thing. On the downside, the bishops are still stuck in. We've done nothing to help release those bishops. Now, why is, for example, knight to f3 the 3rd most popular opening move, right, with nearly 300,000, but knight to c3 is down with only 4,000, right? You see the difference? 295,000 for this guy, only 4,000 for this guy, right? Well, one difference is that one of the ideal things, and one of the reasons why you want to get your minor pieces out into the board, is that you want to be able to castle your king, okay? Another opening principle. Now, if your king wants to castle kingside, it means that you have to move your king's knight and your king's bishop, okay? However, if your king wants to castle queenside, you have to move it to c1, and 3 pieces have to move. Queen's knight, queen's bishop, and the queen herself have to move. So that's just, it takes one more move to get castled. Why do we castle? Okay, one issue is that it puts the king into the corner, right? If you imagine you're facing 2 or 3 opponents, right, and you have like a sword or a spear or whatever, or fists, right? If you can back into a corner, you are cutting off the angles by which your opponents can come and attack you, okay? And the same goes for the king. So the closer you can get your king to the corner, the fewer options there are for your opponent to approach your king. You've got fewer angles of possible attack to worry about, okay? So that's one thing. It means that there's only like, half the board in front of the king there where your opponent's going to come from. The other reason is that it gets your rook closer to the centre of the board. Now, if you do get to castle queenside, one good thing is that your queen's rook then ends up on the d1 square, rather than if you castle kingside, your king goes to g1 and the rook comes to f1. And the difference here is that very often these pawns will push early on, for reasons that we've already covered, and to have your rook straight away on d1 can be very, very good. Particularly, for example, if you've exchanged queens, the king's had to recapture, it's gone on to d8, the pawns are out of the way, and that's how you exchange queens, and then you get to castle this way, and your rook goes straight onto d1, check, boom, right? Good way to get initiative over your opponent. Okay, so that's why knight to c3 is not as popular. All right, and that is move number 8. Okay, and now we're going down, so now we're really in fringe territory, right? Next one, b4, the Polish opening, okay? Does not control any centre squares. He's controlling this and this, so that's not so good. Yes, on the plus side, he's opening up his bishop, or one of his bishops, okay? But he's giving it 2 squares, which is okay, but it's not as good as this pawn moving with 1, 2, 3, 4 squares. Gives the bishop more options there. Plus, you're not really going to fianchetto this bishop and put it on b2, because this pawn's now out there without defense. Okay, if you're going to put your bishop here, generally you want your pawn here where it's defended twice. Okay, so that's the Polish opening. Don't play that. Okay, so that was b3, the Polish. Was it? That was b4. Okay, next one, e3, Van Kreuz opening. Okay, advantages. Just like with e4, lots of scope for the queen, lots of scope for the king's bishop. Okay, that's good. The knights can still come out into the game. That's good. However, we are now controlling these 2 squares, whereas if you'd played the pawn to here, you're controlling these 2 squares. Okay, what's the difference? Well, these 2 squares are in my half of the board. These 2 squares are in my opponent's half of the board. So I'm removing squares in my opponent's own half that he then can't easily use. Okay. What's more, at some point I want to bring this bishop out into the board, and if I put my pawn here, it can't. I'm removing this diagonal, or all 4 squares of it, from my bishop. Okay, so that's less than ideal. So now what's my bishop going to do? Is it going to come here? I might have to end up fianchettoing that bishop, which is no bad thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but that's why e3 is less popular than e4. Okay, next one, as you might guess, d3. Okay, on the plus side, this bishop now has options. Okay, the queen has 1 more square to go to, so that's kind of The knights can still come out into the board, and we're controlling 1 of the central squares as well as this one. Okay. So, but again, on the downside, the light squared bishop is now impeded. So that's why d3 is not so popular. Okay, now we're going down the list and we're starting to scrape the bottom of the barrel. a3, Anderson opening. Okay. Does it release any bishops? Nope. Does it control the center? Nope. Does it impede the knights? Well, yes, it's taken one square away from this knight, but you don't normally want to put your knight there anyway. It's just a wacky opening, so don't play that. Okay. Next one, c3, the Saragossa opening. Apparently, we don't know about all these because we had our opening theory erased by aliens. Saragossa opening. Okay. Does it control the center? Whee! Yes. One square in the center as well as this square. Does it release my bishops? No. Does nothing to do that. Does it get in the way of my knights? Yes. Okay. Can't play knight to c3 now, which is the natural developing square for the knight. So it's rubbish. So don't play that. Okay, that was c3. Next one, g4, the grob. Okay, does it control the center? Does it heckers like? No, it doesn't, right? Does it release my bishop? Well, yes. The king's bishop now has two options, okay? Does it impede the knights? No. But I'm not controlling the center. The pawn itself is not even protected. So that's why that one has been played only 376 times at the top levels. Not good. Next one is h3, the Clements opening. What can we say about this? I mean, it's just like a3, just on the other side of the board. It takes one square away from the knight, which is not a big deal. But look, this pawn is... on a previous move, it was controlling one square. On this move, it's controlling one square. So actually, white has not increased his influence over the board much at all. It's done nothing to release any bishops. It's removed one square from the knight. Don't play that. Simple as that, okay? So what was that? It was h3, okay? Last five, the very sludge in the bottom of the barrel. h4, Kadash opening. I don't know. Doesn't control the center, doesn't help the bishops to get out, doesn't get in the way of the knights, doesn't increase control over the board really. I mean, instead of controlling g3, we're controlling g5. Well, whoopee-doo. I mean, nobody's, heading for g5 anytime soon anyway. So, absolute garbage opening. Knight to h3. Trash. Doesn't control the center. Doesn't release the bishops, etc., etc. f3 now. Okay, the Barnes opening. It's been played a handful of times, right? What's good about it? Well, in its case for the defense, it's controlling e4. So one central square, all right, as well as this square. However, it's getting in the way of the knight, and it's not releasing the bishop. Plus, it's opened up a lovely diagonal for the king. So let's say black does that, and then you bring out a knight or something, and there's always threats of checks, So if white ever puts a piece anywhere on here, could face check, has to get out of check, and queen takes. Right, so that's why it's down at the bottom of the list, because it's crap. Okay, equally unpopular as that, which tends to produce a lot of draws, is a4, the Ware opening. Right, does it control the center? Nope. Release bishops? Nope. Get in where the knights? Nope. Okay, does it increase control of the board? Not really much. Instead of b3, we're controlling b5, and that's it. Okay. So that's rubbish as well. And the least popular move of the lot, which interestingly gets a better score for white than any other move, but it's only been played 23 times, is the atrocious knight to a3, the sodium attack. Right. I mean, you don't need me to go through this. Don't control the center, don't release bishops. Put a knight on the edge of the board, knights on the rim are dim. It's just awful. Why people want to play that, I have no idea. So basically, if you want to gain as much control over the board as possible in the opening, you want to free things up for your pieces to enter the game and to develop, then your best moves, well, in fact, the best move, I would say, is pawn to e4, right? Because your bishop's got scope, so has your queen. your knights aren't impeded, okay, and you're controlling two central squares. Well, one square in the center and another fairly useful square on f5 as well. Okay, if you want to, you can also play d4. Other than that, if you're a beginner, there's no real good reason to play anything else. Okay, you should play either e4 or d4 in the beginning and then respond to whatever your opponent does from there. So all we've looked at in this whole video, right, after having our memories erased by aliens, is we've looked at the options for move number 1 for white. But you can see that there are many considerations in there, right? So I think those are the opening principles. We haven't forgotten our opening principles. Control of the center, develop your pieces. Basically, you want to give yourself flexibility. You want to maximize your control of the board, and you also want to restrict your opponent from doing the same thing. Okay, so controlling the center makes it harder for your opponent to compete for the center. Okay, and if you can, you want to play d4 and e4 some of the time. Okay, and it happens quite a lot. So there you go. That's it. Move number 1 for white. There's only 20 options. 2 of them are very good. A few of them are arguable, and at least 10 of them are absolute doggy-doo. So don't play those, right? Play classical standard openings. Play principled chess. And what we might do as well in the future is, forgetting all about opening theory completely, looking at some actual openings and why those moves are played. So there you go. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.